Ch6 students. We are going to be reviewing some of the risk factors that can set an individual up to develop an anxiety disorder. I'm going to be going over these risk factors in a much more global way. I'm not focusing in on any specific anxiety disorder. So the first one I'm going to focus in on are some of the personality factors that can contribute to the development of an anxiety disorder. The first issue or personality contributor is behavioral inhibition. And what behavioral inhibition is an infant's tendency to be agitated or distressed in an unfamiliar or novel setting. This behavioral inhibition can be observed in infants that are as young as 4 months old, and we believe it to be inherited. Basically what's going on here is that when an infant is presented a new person or a new situation or even a novel toy, they become very stressed or very agitated by the situation and they cry. And what we find is that this is predictive of anxiety in childhood and later on of social anxiety in adolescence. I want to be really clear here. This is different than separation anxiety, which is something that you can see in infants beginning right around maybe 8 months, 9 months, up until they are even 2.5 or 3. That is a different behavior. That is when the primary caregiver, usually mom, leaves and the child becomes distressed and cries at the departure of their primary caregiver. When I'm using the term behavioral inhibition, what I'm really talking about here is that even in the presence of that primary caregiver, even when mom is there holding baby and a new person comes along, they become distressed. Even if they social reference and they see mom is being encouraging and saying, say hello, they still cry and are stressed by the situation. Another personality risk factor that we find is the tendency towards neuroticism. For those of you that have forgotten, neuroticism is one aspect of the Big Five. It is a personality profile. Some people score very high in neuroticism. The opposite of neuroticism is emotional stability. People that are neurotic or score high in neuroticism have a tendency to be emotionally unstable. They have a tendency to be worriers. They have a tendency to be very negative. And this tendency to react with frequent negative affect is connected to developing anxiety disorders. Not just anxiety, but also to depression. In fact, scoring high on a personality measurement for neuroticism is linked to double the likelihood of developing an anxiety disorder into adulthood. Are there any other risk factors? There are certain cognitive risk factors that can set a person up for an anxiety disorder. Remember, when I am using that word cognitive, I am talking about the ways that we think. Generally, people that have sustained negative beliefs about the future, this sort of entrenched belief that bad things are going to happen, have a tendency to be predisposed to developing an anxiety disorder. They engage in safety behaviors. And remember, those are the behaviors that a person will engage in order to temporarily decrease those negative thoughts, in order to create a temporary sense of security and mitigate those negative thoughts that they're having. Any sort of belief that one lacks control over their environment, that's another cognitive risk factor that we see that can predispose a person for an anxiety disorder. If a person believes that they cannot control their own destiny or their own environment, they are more vulnerable to developing an anxiety disorder. Childhood trauma or punitive parenting may foster these sorts of beliefs. And I've already talked a little bit about this, that if a child grows up in a household where there is physical abuse, where they experience sexual abuse, or even if they grow up in a home where they have a parent that abuses drugs or alcohol, that leads to a lot of instability, a lot of trauma, and a lot of a real sense of being unable to have any sort of agency or control over their environment, which is a feeling that they will then carry over into adulthood. In addition to that, serious life events can threaten a sense of control, even for adults. So someone who has experienced traumas, things like loss of a loved one, loss of job, several traumas that are sequenced can set one up to feel as if they're not in control. We call this having external locus of control, that an individual feels that outside forces are controlling their environment and their destiny, and they are not in charge of those things. The other cognitive factor that we find in people that struggle with anxiety disorders is attention to threat. People that are predisposed to developing anxiety disorder have a tendency to be very selectively attentive to negative environmental cues. They're really attuned to paying attention to anything that could be perceived as negative or any potential threat in that environment. So what about biological risk factors? We know that psychology has really focused in on the biological and the physiological to help us inform our research and our study, and we've really been geared much more towards looking at biological causes. So here's some biological causes that might set one up for developing an anxiety disorder. We know that there's some sort of genetic link going on there. When we look at twin studies, and remember when I use that term twin studies, I'm talking about identical twins, and identical twins share 100% of their genes. We're talking about identical twins that have been separated at birth. So though they share 100% of their genes, they do not share an environment. And when we look at these twins, we find a fairly significant level of heritability. It's about 20 to 40% for phobias, GAD, and PTSD. So what that means is that if one twin develops, say, a phobia, there's a 20 to 40% chance that the other one will also. We find about a 50% chance of this for panic disorder. We also know that just having a relative with a phobia increases the likelihood for other anxiety disorders. So we believe something genetic is probably going on here. Now, it may be that those genetic factors are impacting a person's neurobiology, and we do know that there's some neurobiological variables that can be contributors to anxiety disorders. One of the main things we see neurobiologically is an overactivity in an individual's fear circuit. So I'm talking about that flight or fight system that I've already discussed. In other words, that person has a sensitive amygdala, and I've got a little visual here for you to understand where that amygdala is. For those of you that have forgotten, remember the amygdala is the center for emotional memory. This is also where we house anger and fear. And if a person has a sensitive or an overactive amygdala, and that is combined with a medial prefrontal cortex deficits, that person seems to be predisposed to developing an anxiety disorder. So let me explain this a little further. Your prefrontal cortex is there to help mitigate the information that the amygdala sends out. So the amygdala is sending out some high-powered emotional information. It hits your prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is there to make sense of that, to make logic of that, and to put it into context, and essentially to mitigate that full impact. If there's a deficit in the prefrontal cortex, if the prefrontal cortex is not doing its job, and you're combining that with an overactive amygdala, you're going to be set up to develop an anxiety disorder. Another neurobiological contributor can be neurotransmitters. Again, remember, neurotransmitters are those chemicals that neurons use to help them communicate. We see poor functioning of serotonin and GABA in individuals that are struggling with anxiety disorders. We also see higher levels of norepinephrine. And this is something that we see again and again in the research that people that struggle with anxiety disorders have a tendency to be very sensitive to norepinephrine. I'm also going to mention here, earlier on, in an earlier module, I talked about the human biome, the microbes that live in the gut, and the impact that those can have on our neurotransmitters. We know that 75 to 85% of our serotonin is generated by our biome, by the microbes that are in the gut. It could be possible that is what's causing issues with the neurotransmitters that are impacting anxiety. A very fascinating, fabulous piece of research that came out of Washington University, where they actually manipulated the microbes within mice, and found that they could induce an anxiety disorder simply by tinkering with the microbes that lived in their guts. So how might one develop a phobia? And I'm going to go through some etiology of specific phobias. Here we're going to talk a little bit about a behavioral model. And I want to spend some time here because often when we talk about the treatment of anxiety disorders, behaviorism has a tendency to be very effective in terms of a treatment model. And I've talked a little bit about this already, that we, as humans, we have what's called biological preparedness. In other words, we're hardwired or set up to be afraid of things like snakes and spiders. So it's not uncommon. In fact, that's the most common phobias that are out there: snakes, spiders, heights, those sorts of things. But what behaviorism tells us is that we can be conditioned to develop a phobia towards almost anything. And how that happens is it happens through a process of learning. And Maurer gives us a two-factor model where step one focuses in on a classical conditioning process and step two on an operant conditioning process, on which a person can develop a phobia. I'm going to go ahead here and use an example, first an example of a friend of ours who is deathly afraid of dogs. And basically what happened to him as a child is that he experienced a dog bite. This is his unconditioned stimulus. The dog bite it's an unconditioned stimulus. And the conditioned response is that he not only fears this dog, but he comes to develop an aversion to all dogs. It leads him to fear all dogs. And then every time he sees a dog, he feels this fear. The next step, step two, is the operant conditioning. So every time he feels this strong fear, he feels very motivated to avoid dogs. He will go so far as to call before he comes over to make sure that people put their dogs in the backyard, or even to see if there's going to be a dog there. And if there is, he won't come. So he's very motivated to avoid dogs, and what that avoidance strategy does is it relieves his fear, and what it does is it continues to reinforce this avoidance, because the fear becomes relieved as a negative reinforcement. You're taking away something negative. It increases the likelihood that he continues to engage in this avoidance pattern of behavior. So what are some other ways that a person can develop a phobia? Well, modeling and verbal instruction are other ways that a person can do this. So if our friend had ever seen another person harmed by a dog, or had ever seen another person nipped by a dog, this is going to reinforce his fear of dogs. If he's ever gotten any verbal instruction, any warnings about dogs, or been told to avoid dogs, that might continue to add to this development of a phobia towards dogs. What's very interesting here is that this friend of ours has 2 children, and he has instructed them. He's engaged in both modeling and verbal instruction, where he has shown fear of dogs, and he has shown avoidance of dogs, and he has told his children they are not to go near dogs. And even though his kids have never had a negative interaction with a dog, they both fear dogs. What's interesting is those with anxiety tend to acquire fear more readily. They have a tendency to be more resistant to extinction. So for those of you that have forgotten, remember, extinction is a phase of learning in which we unhook the unconditioned stimulus to the conditioned response. In other words, we cut the link between the dog and the fear. It basically, as time goes on, the connection becomes weaker and weaker until it becomes uncoupled. What's interesting about individuals that develop specific phobias to things that we're not hardwired to be afraid of is that they're very resistant to extinction. And what we say is they're just very good learners. They connect the stimulus to the response, and that's it. It stays connected. So when we think about phobias and we take a diathesis approach to that, what we're going to do is we're going to look at this two-factor model of behavioral conditioning. We're going to look at these conditioned responses to threat and the sustained avoidance, or these safety behaviors that individuals engage in. And we're going to connect that up to biological vulnerabilities. And what we find is that people who are biologically vulnerable to anxiety, if they are put into a situation where they come to fear something, or they become conditioned to fear something, they develop the phobia because they're already biologically set up to be vulnerable. And then they go through the conditioning process and they just end up developing the phobia.